The footage begins in silence, a moment that at first seems completely ordinary, nothing unusual, nothing that immediately signals danger, and yet as the seconds pass, something begins to feel slightly off, something subtle but noticeable enough to create a quiet sense of unease, because a young woman stands inside an elevator, and her movements do not follow the natural rhythm of someone simply pressing a button and waiting. Instead they appear uncertain, unpredictable, as if she is reacting to something that exists just outside the frame, something that cannot be seen but is clearly affecting her behavior. She presses multiple buttons, not just one floor but several, her fingers moving quickly, almost urgently, as if she is trying to force the elevator to respond faster than it should. Then she steps back into the corner, her body tense, her posture defensive, her eyes fixed on the hallway outside, watching with a focus that feels too intense for an empty space. And as she moves forward again, carefully leaning out to look, she suddenly pulls herself back inside, repeating the motion more than once, as if she is unsure whether it is safe to step out, and at one point her hands begin to move in unusual gestures, controlled yet difficult to interpret, as if she is communicating with someone who remains completely invisible to the camera. And through all of this, the hallway remains empty, silent, unchanged, while the elevator door stays open far longer than it should, refusing to close in a way that feels mechanical but strangely deliberate, creating a moment that feels suspended in time, as if something unseen is interrupting what should have been a simple, routine action. This was the last known footage of Elisa Lam, a 21-year-old student from Canada who arrived in Los Angeles in January 2013 as part of a solo journey across the United States, documenting her thoughts and experiences through writing, presenting herself as someone reflective, observant, and searching for meaning, someone who appeared to be exploring not only the world around her but also her own inner thoughts. She checked into the Cecil Hotel in downtown Los Angeles, a building that at one time had been considered respectable but over the years had developed a reputation connected to crime, violence, and unsettling events, although for many visitors, including Elisa, it appeared simply as an affordable place to stay, a temporary stop in a much larger journey, and at first everything seemed normal. She explored the city, visited local places, remained in contact with her family, and continued her trip, without any clear sign that something was wrong. But within days something began to change, not suddenly, not in a way that immediately raised alarm, but gradually, quietly, in a way that could easily be overlooked, because she had originally been staying in a shared room with other travelers before being moved to a private room, and while the exact reason was never fully explained, there were suggestions that her behavior may have seemed unusual enough to concern others, though nothing at that time clearly indicated danger. Then, on January 31st, she disappeared, and unlike situations where there are signs of struggle or clear evidence of what happened, this moment came without warning, without noise, without explanation, leaving behind only absence, because one moment she was present, part of the world around her, and the next she was completely gone, without a trace that could easily be followed. Her parents, who had been in regular contact with her, quickly realized something was wrong when they could no longer reach her, and what began as simple concerns soon turned into fear as calls went unanswered and messages remained unread, creating a silence that felt heavier with each passing hour, until it became clear that this was not a normal situation. The Los Angeles Police Department began an investigation, searching the hotel, questioning staff, reviewing available information, trying to reconstruct her last known movements, but inside the building there was nothing that provided a clear answer. No witnesses who saw her leave, no evidence of forced entry, no indication of where she had gone, and this lack of information made the situation even more unsettling, because it created the impression that she had simply disappeared into nothing. Days passed, then weeks, and still there was no trace of her, until the case took a sudden turn when the police released the elevator footage, and what had once been a missing person investigation began to transform into something far more disturbing, because the video did not provide answers, it created more questions, raising possibilities that were difficult to explain, and as millions of people watched it, analyzed it, and tried to understand it, no single explanation was able to fully account for what was seen. Some believed she was reacting to someone just outside the camera's view, others suggested a psychological episode, while some began to consider explanations that went beyond what could be easily understood, yet none of these theories answered the one question that mattered most, because despite all the attention, despite all the analysis, Elisa Lam was still missing. Inside the hotel, life continued, guests came and went, staff followed their routines, but slowly something began to feel wrong as complaints started to come in about the water, the pressure was low, the taste was unusual, some guests noticed a strange smell, others mentioned discoloration, and what at first seemed like a minor issue gradually became something that could not be ignored, leading the hotel staff to inspect the water tanks on the roof in search of a simple explanation. But what they were about to discover would turn this case into something far darker than anyone had imagined, because Elisa Lam had not disappeared in the way people believed. She had been inside the building the entire time, hidden in a place no one expected to look, and when she was finally found, the truth raised more questions than answers, leaving behind a mystery that would continue to disturb people long after the case itself was closed. As the investigation moved forward, what initially appeared to be a missing person case began to take on a different shape, one that felt heavier, more serious, because the absence of Elisa Lam was no longer just about where she had gone, but about what had happened inside a place that was supposed to be controlled, monitored, and understood, and yet seemed to offer no clear answers. Detectives from the Los Angeles Police Department returned to the hotel, not just to search again but to look deeper, to question details that may have been overlooked, to examine areas that might not have seemed important at first, because when a person disappears without a trace, it is often the smallest details that begin to matter the most. They reviewed surveillance footage from different parts of the building, hoping to find any sign of Elisa leaving, any moment that could explain her movement after the elevator video, but nothing appeared, no clear image of her exiting the hotel, no evidence of her walking through the lobby, no indication that she had stepped outside, and this absence created a troubling possibility that she may have never left the building at all. At the same time, investigators began speaking more closely with hotel staff and guests, trying to understand the environment she had been in during her final days, and while some described her as quiet, others mentioned that her behavior had seemed unusual at times, not aggressive, not dangerous, but different enough to be remembered, though not enough to immediately raise alarm. Her digital activity was also examined, her phone records, her online presence, the last messages she had sent, and while these details helped establish a timeline, they did not provide a clear explanation, because everything seemed to stop suddenly, without a transition, without a moment that could explain what had changed. Meanwhile, the hotel itself became a central focus of the investigation, not just as a location but as an environment, a place with its own history, its own patterns, its own atmosphere, because the Cecil Hotel had long been associated with incidents that were difficult to ignore, and while history alone does not explain a single case, it added a layer of unease that could not be separated from what was happening. As days passed, the complaints about the water continued, growing more frequent, more specific, guests describing not just low pressure, but an unusual taste, a strange smell, something that did not feel right, something that suggested that the issue was not simply mechanical, but something deeper, something that required immediate attention. Hotel staff initially treated it as a maintenance issue, something that could be resolved through routine inspection, but as the complaints increased, it became clear that a more thorough check was necessary, and this led them to the rooftop, where the building's water tanks were located, large containers that supplied water to the entire hotel. The rooftop itself was not an area that guests were supposed to access freely, it required specific routes, controlled entry points, and yet as staff made their way up, following procedure, expecting to find a technical problem, they could not have anticipated what they were about to see. When the tank was opened, what they found immediately changed the nature of the case, because inside, in a place that was never meant to be occupied, was the body of Elisa Lam. The discovery was not only shocking but deeply unsettling, because it raised questions that were far more complex than the original disappearance, questions about how she had reached that location, how she had entered the tank, and why no one had noticed anything earlier despite the building being active and occupied. For investigators, this moment marked a turning point because the case was no longer about finding a missing person, it was about understanding how something like this could happen in a place filled with people, cameras, and systems that were meant to prevent exactly this kind of situation. The rooftop access became a critical detail because according to hotel management, doors leading to the roof were supposed to be secured, alarmed, and monitored, meaning that any unauthorized access should have triggered alerts, yet no clear record of such an event was immediately presented, creating uncertainty about how Elisa could have reached that area without being detected. There was also the physical challenge of the water tanks themselves, large, elevated, not easily accessible, requiring effort and intention to reach, and this added another layer of complexity, because it suggested that whatever had happened was not simple, not accidental in the way people might initially assume. At the same time, the condition of the scene raised further questions, because there were no immediate signs that clearly pointed to another person being involved, no obvious evidence of forced entry into the tank, no clear indication of struggle that could be easily identified, and this lack of clarity made the situation even more difficult to interpret. Investigators began reconstructing the timeline again, now with new information, trying to understand how the elevator footage connected to the rooftop, how her movements inside the building could have led to a location that seemed so distant from where she was last seen, and whether there were gaps in the surveillance that could explain the missing pieces. The case quickly drew widespread attention, not only because of its disturbing nature, but because of the unanswered questions that continued to surround it, questions that did not have simple explanations, questions that challenged assumptions about safety, control, and visibility in environments that people often take for granted. And as more details emerged, it became clear that this was not a case that would be easily understood, because every answer seemed to create new questions, and every explanation left something unresolved, leaving behind a mystery that extended far beyond the initial disappearance, into something deeper, something that would continue to be discussed long after the investigation itself moved forward. As the discovery of Elisa Lam's body shifted the investigation into a new and more complex phase, the focus moved from searching to understanding, from finding to explaining, because now the question was no longer where she was, but how she had ended up in a place that seemed so difficult to reach and so unlikely to be accessed without notice. Investigators began carefully examining every detail surrounding the rooftop, the access points, the layout of the building, and the systems that were supposed to prevent unauthorized entry, because according to hotel management, the doors leading to the roof were secured and alarmed, which meant that any attempt to enter should have triggered a response, yet there was no clear record of such an alert, creating a contradiction that could not be easily explained. At the same time, attention returned to the elevator footage because it remained the last confirmed record of Elisa Lam's movements, and investigators needed to determine whether her behavior in that video could provide clues about what happened next, whether it reflected fear, confusion, or something else entirely, something that might explain how she moved from the elevator to the rooftop without being clearly seen. Her actions in the footage were analyzed repeatedly, frame by frame, by both investigators and the public, and while many interpretations were suggested, none could be confirmed with certainty, because the video showed only a limited perspective, capturing her behavior but not the full context of what she was experiencing at that moment. Meanwhile, forensic specialists examined the scene on the rooftop, focusing on the water tank itself, its structure, its height, and the way it could be accessed, because reaching it required more than simply walking up. It required climbing, positioning, and a level of physical effort that raised further questions about how she had managed to do so unnoticed. There were also questions about the lid of the tank, whether it had been open or closed, whether it had been moved, and whether any evidence could indicate how she entered, but reports on these details varied, adding another layer of uncertainty to a case that already lacked clear answers. As investigators continued their work, Elisa Lam's personal history became part of the discussion, not as a conclusion, but as a factor that could not be ignored, because understanding a person's state of mind can sometimes provide context for actions that might otherwise seem impossible to explain. It was known that she had experienced mental health challenges in the past, and while this information was important, it did not provide a complete explanation, because even with that context, the physical circumstances of how she reached the rooftop and entered the tank remained difficult to fully understand. At the same time, speculation began to grow outside the official investigation, with theories spreading across the internet, some grounded in logic, others driven by imagination, and while public interest can bring attention to a case, it can also create confusion, because not all interpretations are based on verified information. Some suggested that there may have been someone else involved, pointing to the unusual behavior in the elevator as possible evidence of interaction with another person, while others believed that her actions could be explained by a psychological episode, and still others began to connect the case to the hotel's history, suggesting patterns that extended beyond a single event. For investigators, however, the focus remained on evidence, on what could be proven, on what could be supported by physical findings and verified timelines, because in cases like this, conclusions must be based on facts rather than speculation. They examined the building systems again, reviewed staff procedures, and attempted to identify any gaps that could explain how access to the rooftop might have occurred without detection, considering possibilities such as unsecured doors, malfunctioning alarms, or human error, all of which could contribute to a situation that seemed impossible at first glance. The timeline was reconstructed repeatedly, connecting the last known sighting in the elevator to the estimated time she was on the rooftop, trying to understand not just the sequence of events, but the transitions between them, because it was within those transitions that the most important details were likely hidden. Despite these efforts, certain elements of the case remained unclear, not because they were ignored, but because the available evidence did not provide a definitive answer, and this lack of clarity is what often makes a case persist in public memory, because unanswered questions tend to remain long after the main events have been documented. As the investigation moved closer to its conclusion, the challenge was not only to present findings, but to determine whether those findings could fully explain what had happened, or whether some aspects would remain uncertain, leaving space for continued discussion and interpretation. And in this case, that uncertainty became part of the story itself, because while many details were established, the combination of unusual behavior, complex physical circumstances, and limited direct evidence created a situation where not every question could be answered in a way that satisfied everyone, leaving behind a case that would continue to be examined, debated, and remembered as one of the most unsettling mysteries in modern true crime. As the investigation moved toward its conclusion, the focus shifted from uncovering new evidence to interpreting what had already been found, because by this point, detectives had gathered as much information as possible from the scene, from the building, and from Elisa Lam's personal background. Yet the challenge remained in connecting those details into a single explanation that could account for everything without leaving critical gaps. The official findings began to take shape through forensic reports, timelines, and medical examinations, each piece contributing to a broader understanding of what may have occurred, and according to the autopsy, there were no clear signs of physical trauma that would indicate an attack by another person, no injuries that could directly suggest a struggle, and toxicology results did not reveal substances that would clearly explain extreme impairment. At the same time, the report noted factors that pointed toward the possibility of accidental circumstances, including the environment in which she was found and the conditions that could have developed once she entered the tank, because the structure of the water container made it extremely difficult to exit without assistance, especially once inside, where surfaces were slippery and confined. Investigators also considered the role of her mental state, not as a definitive answer, but as an element that could have influenced her behavior, because it was known that she had been managing mental health conditions, and inconsistencies in medication use could potentially lead to disorientation, confusion, or actions that might not align with typical patterns of behavior. However, even with this context, the case did not become simple because the physical path she would have needed to take to reach the rooftop, access the tank, and enter it still required explanation, and while it was determined that there were possible routes she could have used, including areas that may not have been fully secured, these possibilities depended on a series of conditions aligning in a way that was difficult to confirm with absolute certainty. As a result, the final classification of the case was determined to be an accidental death, a conclusion based on the available evidence, the absence of clear signs of foul play, and the circumstances surrounding the environment in which she was found. Yet this conclusion did not eliminate the sense of uncertainty that many people continued to feel. Because while an official explanation provides closure from a legal and investigative standpoint, it does not always address every question that arises from unusual circumstances, and in this case, several aspects remain difficult to fully reconcile, including the elevator footage, the timing of events, and the lack of definitive evidence showing exactly how each step unfolded. The public response reflected this uncertainty as discussions continued, theories persisted, and the case became widely known not only for what was discovered, but for what could not be fully explained, because when an event contains elements that do not align perfectly with expectations, it often leaves space for ongoing interpretation. At the same time, it is important to separate speculation from verified information, because while many ideas may seem compelling, the investigation itself relied on evidence that could be confirmed, and within that framework, the conclusion reached was consistent with the findings available to investigators. The Cecil Hotel, already known for its history, became even more associated with the case, drawing attention not only to the building itself but to the broader idea of how environments can influence perception, especially when combined with events that are difficult to fully understand. For those who followed the case closely, the story of Elisa Lam became more than just a single incident. It became a reminder of how complex real-life situations can be, how not every detail fits neatly into a clear narrative, and how uncertainty can remain even after extensive investigation. It also highlighted the role of modern media and the internet, where information spreads quickly, interpretations multiply, and public interest can shape how a case is remembered, sometimes emphasizing the mysterious aspects more than the confirmed facts. In the end, the investigation provided an answer, but not a complete sense of closure for everyone, because while the official conclusion addressed the most critical questions, it left behind smaller ones that continued to resonate, questions about moments that were not captured, decisions that were not fully understood, and events that could not be reconstructed with absolute clarity. And this is what gives the case its lasting impact, not only the tragedy of what happened, but the fact that even with all the information gathered, even with all the analysis conducted, there remains a sense that something about it cannot be fully explained, a feeling that continues to draw attention, reflection, and discussion long after the case itself was officially closed. As time passed and the investigation officially came to an end, the case of Elisa Lam did not fade in the way most cases do, because while many investigations close with clear answers that gradually move out of public attention, this one remained, not because of a lack of effort, but because of the feeling it left behind, a sense that something about it was never fully resolved in the minds of those who followed it. The details were documented, the reports were completed, and the conclusion was recorded, yet the combination of unusual behavior, limited visibility, and unanswered questions created a narrative that continued to exist beyond the official findings, a narrative shaped not only by facts, but by perception, interpretation, and the natural human tendency to search for meaning in situations that do not feel complete. For many, the elevator footage remained the central focus, not just as evidence, but as an image that captured a moment without context, a moment that seemed to suggest more than it revealed, because when behavior appears disconnected from what can be seen, it invites questions that are difficult to fully answer, questions about what was experienced, what was perceived, and what may never be known. At the same time, the physical reality of the case remained unchanged, the location, the timeline, the evidence that was collected, all of it forming the foundation upon which the investigation was built. Yet even within that structure, there were gaps, not because they were ignored, but because certain moments simply could not be reconstructed with complete precision. This balance between what is known and what remains uncertain is what gives some cases their lasting presence, because when every detail is explained, a story reaches its end, but when small uncertainties remain, they continue to draw attention, to invite reflection, and to keep the case alive in public memory. The story of Elisa Lam also became a reflection of how modern audiences engage with true crime, how footage can be analyzed repeatedly, how theories can develop rapidly, and how information, both accurate and speculative, can spread across platforms, shaping the way a case is understood far beyond the original investigation. In this process, the line between fact and interpretation can become less clear, not intentionally, but naturally, as people attempt to fill in the gaps with ideas that seem to make sense, even when those ideas are not supported by verified evidence, and this is where the importance of distinguishing between what is known and what is assumed becomes essential. Because while it is natural to search for explanations, it is equally important to recognize the limits of what can be confirmed, to understand that not every question will have a clear answer, and that uncertainty, while uncomfortable, is sometimes an unavoidable part of reality. For the family of Elisa Lam, the case was never about mystery or interpretation, it was about loss, about the absence of someone who had been present, about a life that had been interrupted in a way that could not be undone, and within that reality, the focus shifts away from speculation and toward remembrance. And this is perhaps the most important part of the story, not the theories that continue to circulate, not the questions that remain, but the fact that behind all of it was a real person with thoughts, experiences, and a life that extended far beyond the final moments that became widely known. As the years passed, the case remained a topic of discussion, revisited in documentaries, articles, and conversations, each time bringing attention back to the same questions, the same footage, the same unresolved feelings, and while perspectives may differ, the core of the story remains unchanged. It is a reminder that not every event can be fully understood, that not every detail can be explained, and that sometimes the most lasting impact of a case comes not from the answers it provides, but from the questions it leaves behind. And in that sense, the case of Elisa Lam continues to exist not only as an investigation that reached its conclusion, but as a story that remains open in the minds of those who have encountered it, a story defined as much by its uncertainty as by its facts, and remembered for the feeling it created as much as for the details it contained.